Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. This is your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I've been teaching A&P since 2002. Today's episode, we're going to finish up the heart talking about the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is basically everything that's happening in your heart from one contraction to the next. And there's a lot going on. I'm going to be talking about a specific diagram that looks at all of the different aspects of the cardiac cycle at once. But first, I want to address a question that I got from a listener. This question comes from Allie, who is a triathlon coach. And Allie wants to know, how does your body absorb and process water on a cellular level? And why does it not work to take in water as one big bolus rather than better to sip it bit by bit in order for your body to become hydrated? There's actually a lot of reasons for that. And not a lot of it has to do with how cells process water. It's mostly about how our organs can process water and how much water they can handle at once. Cells process water on an osmotic basis. So when there is water outside the cell that has a lower concentration of solutes than the water inside the cell, then water will move into the cell across the membrane using aquaporins, which are channel proteins for water. And also some water can actually go right through the phospholipid bilayer through the small gaps between the fatty acids. When the concentration of solutes is greater outside the cell than inside the cell, then water will move across the membrane out of the cell and into the interstitial fluid. So this is just the osmotic gradients. And you can go back to a previous episode where I talk about diffusion and osmosis to get some further detail on the processes of osmosis. However, when you're taking water in really big gulps, it's more difficult for your digestive tract to handle that much water because the absorption of water across the mucous membrane of the digestive tract is going to be limited. And if you have too much water, it's going to be hard for it to absorb all that water. Furthermore, when that water gets to your kidneys, for your kidneys to process, your kidneys could be overloaded with too much water and it will end up producing more urine than it needs to. So you will counteract your hydration efforts by increasing the amount of urine that you're putting out by your kidneys. So that's kind of the quick and dirty answer on why it's better to sip water than to chug water if you're concerned with hydration. Thank you for sending me that question, Allie. I really appreciate it when the listeners send me emails and engage. And you can also send me an email if you have a question. The email address is -55media@gmail.com. So feel free to send me your questions or comments or anything that you want to communicate with me. Thanks again, Allie. Okay, so now let's talk about the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is one complete contraction and relaxation of all four chambers of the heart. The blood's movement to, through, and from the heart is influenced by pressure and flow, and it's regulated by the heart's four one-way valves. So if you remember when we talked about the anatomy of the heart, that there are valves that are regulating the movement of blood so that it goes in the right direction. And those valves are the atrioventricular valves, regulating the flow from atria to ventricles, and the semilunar valves, regulating the flow from ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta. There are several factors to consider during the time it takes to complete the cardiac cycle. They are the pressure exerted by blood in the heart's chambers, the volume of blood in the heart's chambers, the electrical activity of the heart, and the sounds coming from the heart. We can look at all these factors at once using something called the Wiggers diagram. It separates each of these factors of the cardiac cycle on their own chart as they happen simultaneously over the same period of time. Hey, it's me. I know I sound a little bit different right now because most of this episode was recorded in a hotel room while I was away at an anatomy and physiology symposium. But I wanted to jump in on the side to let you know that you can find this Wiggers diagram on my Twitter account and my Instagram account. I have posted it on both of those. Both of those accounts are Student Help 4AP. That's the number 4. Student Help, the number 4, AP. Go find me on Instagram or Twitter, and you will see my post of the Wiggers diagram. So that way you can use the visual while you're listening to this episode. Okay, back to the episode. Even though both atria contract at roughly the same time and both ventricles contract at roughly the same time, the Wiggers diagram focuses on the left side of the heart. So keep in mind that the right side would have a similar looking chart, but the pressures would be lower. So when you're looking at this diagram, again, keep in mind it's only talking about the left side of the heart. Remember we talked about systole. Systole is the time when the chambers are contracting. And diastole is the time in between contractions. There's both atrial systole and ventricular systole because we know they don't contract at the same time. However, when you're talking to someone clinically or even academically, if they just say systole, they mean when the ventricles are contracting. That's the classic systole. The cardiac cycle is divided into phases and subphases. So we're going to start with phase 1A, which is early in diastole. So that means it's as soon as the ventricles have finished relaxing and they're at rest. The pressure in the relaxing atria and ventricles is very low because the relaxing cardiac muscle doesn't exert any force on the remaining blood in those chambers. Remember that oxygen-poor blood is always arriving at the heart from the body's systemic circulation through the superior and inferior vena cava. And that blood is entering the right atrium. Now, while that's happening, because this is a circulatory system, blood is also returning to the heart from the lungs. And that's oxygen-rich blood coming to the left atrium from the pulmonary veins. Since the ventricles are relaxed and spread apart, the tension on the chorda tendineae keeps the left and right atrioventricular valves open. Now those chorda tendineae are the tendinous cords, that's another way of saying that, of the atrioventricular valves. Since the pressure in the atria is higher than that of the ventricles, blood passively flows rapidly from the atria to the ventricles because those AV valves are open. That means the ventricular volume is increasing, and we call that rapid ventricular filling. Meanwhile, the low pressure of the ventricles allows the semilunar valves to remain closed. So the semilunar valves are regulating the flow of blood from the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and ascending aorta. When there is no pressure or low pressure in the ventricles are not contracting and squeezing blood, those valves remain closed. There's no pressure forcing them open. That also means that the pressure in the ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk are low. They're decreasing at that time because there's nothing being forced into them. The pressure in the atria continues to drop and just about match the pressure in the ventricles, which decreases the rate of ventricular filling. So if the pressure in the atria and the pressure in the ventricles are starting to become normalized, there won't be as much of a force causing blood to go from the atria to the ventricles. So ventricular filling starts to decline. This period is called diastasis, and it is phase 1B of the cardiac cycle. During diastole, the ECG is flat because there is no electrical activity taking place. Phase 1C encompasses atrial contraction or atrial systole. Even though the heading says diastole on the Wiggers diagram, remember that that only refers to ventricular diastole. The pressure in the atria rises as the cardiac muscle compresses the remaining blood in the atria. Remember, that cardiac muscle is called pectinate muscle. Since that blood is now being forced into the ventricles, the ventricular pressure also rises, and the ventricular volume rises. So we increase the volume of fluid in the ventricles, and the pressure increases. The cardiac action potentials resulting in atrial contraction cause the P wave of the ECG. You might remember that from the last episode. Since the atrial contractions are just after the action potentials, the P wave begins just before the end of phase 1b and finishes during phase 1c. The flat line of the ECG between the P wave and the Q deflection is the time the signal is traveling from the AV node to the AV bundle to the bundle branches before it gets to the Purkinje fibers of the subendocardial conducting network. Phase 1c ends with the action potentials reaching the Purkinje fibers in the apex of the heart, which is indicated by the Q wave on the ECG. Phase 2 begins with the start of ventricular contractions, which we call systole, and that is indicated by the peak of the QRS complex. Phase 2 is the very short period of time when the ventricles are contracting, but the semilunar valves have not yet opened. The volume of blood in the ventricles at this time is called the end diastolic volume, meaning the total amount of blood that filled the ventricles during diastole. Since the contraction of the ventricles relieves the tension on the chordae tendineae, the pressure in the ventricles forces the AV valves closed, so blood can't go backwards into the atria, which we would call regurg. If the valves are not functioning properly, then blood is able to go backward, and that's a problem. Sometimes, especially the mitral valve, the left AV valve, doesn't close all the way, or when it closes, one of the cusps of it pushes backward into the atria. And that we call mitral valve prolapse. And when that happens, blood can't efficiently be pumped from the ventricle to the ascending aorta because too much of it is heading backward into the atria. So that we would call mitral valve regurg. And over time, that might have to be addressed with a valve replacement. There's a pretty significant percentage of the population that might actually have mitral valve prolapse. So now when we're contracting the ventricles and the blood's not moving yet, it's kind of like squeezing a water balloon, right? No water's coming out. The water balloon is tied off. And you're increasing the pressure inside that water balloon because you're squeezing it and there's no release. So when the ventricles are contracting against a volume of blood that isn't moving against a closed valve, the pressure inside the ventricles goes up very quickly. We call this kind of contraction isovolumetric because iso means same and volume means the amount of blood that's in the ventricles. So it's a contraction that doesn't change the volume of blood in the ventricles. So that's an isovolumetric contraction. No blood is ejecting at that point. Then we start phase 3, and that's when the semilunar valves open. So from the left ventricle, the aortic valve opens into the ascending aorta. We call this ventricular ejection. So the force of the pressure of that blood against the aortic valve pushes it open. And then blood is ejected into the ascending aorta. This is going to sharply decrease the ventricular volume because the blood's leaving. And it increases the aortic pressure because the blood is entering the aorta. So it increases the pressure on the walls of the ascending aorta. After the ventricular pressure peaks, the open aortic valve allows it to begin to fall. The relaxation phase of the ventricular cardiac muscle is reflected in the T wave of the ECG. Blood continues to return to the atria at this time, and with the atrioventricular valves closed, the atrial pressure begins to go up. So we got the AV valves closed, but those veins are still bringing blood back to the heart. So now the atrial pressure is increasing because the atrial volume is increasing. There's no passive filling of the ventricles at this time because the AV valve is closed. The final phase of the cardiac cycle is phase 4, and it's the beginning of the next diastole, the next period of time in between beats. The decline in ventricular pressure allows the semilunar valves, like the aortic valve, to close. And the relaxing ventricular cardiac muscle causes a rapid decline in ventricular pressure. So when the ventricles are not contracting, there's not a lot of pressure on the blood that's in the ventricles. With the AV valves still closed, the ventricular volume remains constant, so this is called isovolumetric relaxation. So remember, we had isovolumetric contraction. The ventricles are contracting against closed semilunar valves. So the blood's not going anywhere, but the ventricles are contracting on it. Then we have closed AV valves. After the blood's ejected from the ventricles, they relax, but no new blood is coming in. There's still going to be some blood left over from the contraction because the ventricles don't pump all the blood out. There's a fraction of the blood that actually gets moved into the aorta, and we call that the ejection fraction. The amount of blood that was in the ventricle that actually gets pumped into the aorta. Since this is the end of systole, the volume of blood in those ventricles is called the end systolic volume. The amount of blood the left ventricle actually pumps into the ascending aorta is known as the stroke volume. And it's calculated by subtracting the blood left over after systole, the end systolic volume, from the blood it held at the beginning of systole, which was the end diastolic volume. Phase 4 ends when the ventricle expands enough to pull open the AV valves and await the next heartbeat.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to Bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
Okay, what we didn't talk about yet is the sounds that the heart makes. So think about going to a doctor and they put a stethoscope over your heart and they listen to your heart sounds. That's called auscultation. The heart makes 4 sounds, but only 3 can be potentially heard with a stethoscope. The 2 most audible sounds are called S1 and S2. S1 happens in phase 2, at the beginning of systole when the AV valves close. The sound that's produced is not the contraction of the cardiac muscle. The sound that produced is actually the blood slamming up against the ventricular side of the closed AV valves. So the ventricles contract. The force of blood being exerted by the contracting ventricles slams shut the AV valve, and the blood is slammed up against the AV valve, and that makes a sound, and that is our first heart sound, which we describe as the lub, L-U-B-B. S1 happens in phase 2, remember, the beginning of systole. S2 happens in phase 4, as the semilunar valves close. So when the semilunar valves close, which is the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve, the blood that's in the pulmonary trunk and the ascending aorta falls back into those valves. And that makes the second sound, S2. And we call that the DUP, D-U-P-P. So the sound is described as lub-dup, 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 lub-dup. Now, in people under 30 years old, you may hear a heart sound in between beats caused by an increase in pressure in the atria. But it's really not normal to hear this in most adults, and we call that S3. Let's talk a little bit about the volume of blood that's leaving the heart. So the stroke volume, which we abbreviate SV, tells us how much blood the heart pumps per beat. The heart rate is how many beats per minute the heart is doing. we can use these two factors to calculate what's called the cardiac output, or CO. Heart rate would be HR. CO, or cardiac output, is the total volume of blood the heart pumps per minute. If the stroke volume is 70 milliliters and the heart rate is 70 beats per minute, we can multiply these two to get a cardiac output of 4,900 milliliters per minute. Or you could say 4.90 liters per minute. As the heart rate goes up, like when you're exercising, so does the cardiac output. If the heart rate gets stronger and able to increase its stroke volume, the heart rate can decrease. If the heart gets stronger and it's able to increase its stroke volume, the heart rate can decrease without sacrificing cardiac output. So think about it this way. Let's say you get involved in an exercise program and you start running and doing a lot of cardiovascular exercise. And over time, what you notice is that your resting heart rate goes down. That's because you have made your heart stronger with that exercise. Just like if you did a bunch of biceps curls, you'd be able to lift more weight. So the ventricles can pump more blood per beat. Now, the cardiac output at rest doesn't need to go up. So if you still only need about 5 liters of blood in a minute, but you're pumping more blood per beat, the number of beats can go down, and you'll still get the same cardiac output. That's healthier for your heart because 1, it's less work, and 2, it's more time in between beats, which means more time that the heart muscle is getting its own blood supply from the coronary vessels. And that's really important. Now remember, the ejection fraction is the percentage that stroke volume is of the end diastolic volume. So if the end diastolic volume is, let's say, 100 milliliters, and the stroke volume is 70 milliliters, then your ejection fraction was 70%. Okay, so hopefully you had a Wiggers diagram to look at while I described all this, because that's the best way to really understand how everything is happening all at once. The heart is just an amazing machine in our bodies, and this is for a lot of people, this is like their favorite part to teach, and for a lot of students it's their favorite part to learn about, because quite frankly, heart disease is the #1 cause of death in the world. So the heart's important, and if you're going into some kind of clinical field, the circulatory system is a really, really good system to have nailed down, because a lot of the clinical practice is going to be centered around circulatory issues and cardiovascular issues. So I hope that this episode has helped you understand the overall workings of the cardiac cycle. I think that's an important one. If it helps you get your B or better on your exam, then we're all happy, because that's the goal here, right? B or better, get into your nursing school, get into your OT school, your PT school, your physician assistant school, whichever direction you're going to go. A&P is the cornerstone of all of that. So I really hope that this is helping you. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again, Allie, for sending me your question. That was a good one. And I was excited to talk about that for a little bit, because I have a background in exercise physiology. So that was a lot of fun. On the next episode, I think we're ready to move on from the circulatory system, and we'll talk a little bit about the lymphatic system. Good luck on your next exam. I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media. Please take the time to rate the podcast, and don't forget to check out my YouTube channel, Student Help for AP. That's Student Help, the number 4, AP. There's a whole lot of tutor videos on there that I think you're going to find helpful. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where you can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost, tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology, already being used at several colleges and universities.